for joining us, and thank you to those joining us online. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. Before I introduce our moderator, I have just a few announcements. Next week's program, Globalization and Its Discontents with Peter Radford, has been canceled. Our next program is on Tuesday, May 27th, and that is a Zoom webinar with Marco Annunziata. The moderated discussion is called Voodoo Economics, Tariffing Our Way to Prosperity or Doom. This will be online at 5:30, and you can register on our website. Or you can sign up in our new May-June brochure. I ask that you please silence your cell phones. And I would also like to thank GNAT-TV for being here to videotape and manage the live stream. And a huge thanks to the Southern Vermont Arts Center and its staff for welcoming us here. This is a wonderful venue of which I hope you visit their galleries and dine at Curate Cafe. I have the honor of introducing our moderator. Brian Edward Suslak is a former business owner and a partner in numerous commercial real estate endeavors. He is also a former partner at McDonald & Company, specializing in mergers and acquisitions. He resides in Arlington, Vermont, and volunteers for local nonprofit organizations. And last year, he moderated a fascinating discussion with an expert on artificial intelligence. Brian will do the honors of introducing our guest speaker. Thank you, Brian, and thank you all.
Thank you, Gloria, and thank you, Galen Jackson. There you are. Thank you for providing us with your knowledge today. We're all looking forward to, and I know many people in the community have mentioned this as something they'd like to attend. I'm sure that you were supposed to give this originally on February 6th, and in the time since then, between now and much has transpired, and I'm sure that required you to review your slides and go through some editing since that time. I'd like to give a brief introduction to Galen and his background. He's Associate Professor of Political Science at Williams College, and he serves as the Co-Director of the Stanley Kaplan Program in American Foreign Policy. He's reviewed a number of articles on diplomacy and foreign policy and authored numerous book reviews and articles on international relations, appearing in such periodicals as Middle East Journal, International Security, Journal of Cold War Studies, and many others. Dr. Jackson recently wrote a book, A Last Peace of Great Powers, Politics, and the Arab-Israeli Dispute of 1967 to 1969, which was published in 2023 by Cornell University Press. And he's currently teaching, or recently taught classes on a number of subjects in international relations, and germane to this topic today, they included the cyber age, nuclear weapons, and world politics, international security, and the cyber revolution, amongst others. So today's format will begin with a presentation. I call you Galen. Sure. Thank you. We'll begin by Galen presenting a slide presentation, and after that is over, we'll have a question and answer period, which I'm sure will be fascinating. Before we start, I'd like to just talk on a personal note about this discussion. More than 50 years ago, I was first introduced to the subject of how modern technological changes in weapons affects the U.S. foreign policy. And that was taught to me by my academic advisor, Dr. Robert Legvold, who was an expert on Sino-Soviet relations, and particularly how that affected nuclear policy with the United States international relations. Dr. Legvold was a professor at Tufts College in the Fletcher School of International Law and Diplomacy, and then went on to become the director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia University. And little did I know that 50 years ago, here I would be standing in Manchester, Vermont, on a discussion of the same sort, how nuclear weapons have changed over time and how they're affecting United States foreign policy today. But we didn't expect it to be on this subject, which was cyber weapons. That would have been science fiction 50 years ago. So on that note, I'd like to introduce Galen and thank him for coming today to educate us in Manchester, and I know this subject will be meaningful and important to everybody here today. Galen, I'm giving the floor to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Ryan. Thanks to Gloria for setting this up, and thanks to the Southern Vermont Arts Center. This is a really beautiful venue, so thank you all for being here. Just at the outset, I'll just say if you have kind of technical questions, some of this stuff can be pretty complex. It's probably easier if we save those till the end. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. Today I'm going to be talking about really kind of putting in tension two sides of the debate regarding what's known as the theory of the cyber revolution. And for lack of a better term, I'll be referring throughout to the alarmists and the skeptics. It's probably better to think of this as a spectrum, but for simplicity's sake, that's how I'll talk about it. This isn't a new question. We've kind of been grappling with it for about 2 decades now or so. On the one hand, you have people like the former CIA director, Leon Panetta, who famously warned about a cyber Pearl Harbor, a large-scale cyber attack that could basically put all sorts of US systems out of commission. One former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff considered cyber the single biggest existential threat out there. Former Secretary of State John Kerry, famously during his Senate confirmation hearings, referred to cyber weapons as the nuclear weapons of the 21st century. And I could go on. We've seen this in journalistic accounts. One book titled The Perfect Weapon, which seems to recall Bernard Brody's 1946 book, The Absolute Weapon at the Dawn of the Nuclear Age. Another one, maybe even catchier, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. And of course, during Donald Trump's first term, US doctrine changed in this area such that it allowed for the potential use of nuclear escalation in response to a major cyber attack, and I could go on. On the other hand, you have a number of people, and there's kind of an interesting bifurcation between academics and policymakers, with the former seemingly far more worried about this than the latter, who tend to think a lot of this is overblown. And that yes, this is a new domain of warfare, and we should be paying attention to it, but that this is certainly nowhere near the level of what we were dealing with at the dawn of the nuclear age. So just to give you a quick idea of where we're going to go with the rest of the talk, spend a little more time laying out the specific set of arguments that these two camps kind of lay out, precisely because the analogy to nuclear weapons frequently gets invoked. Spend a little bit of time going over the differences and similarities there. And then I'm going to talk quickly about the 3 cases. Operation Olympic Games, I'll refer to it as the Stuxnet operation for the sake of brevity for the rest of the talk. This was when the United States and Israel famously sabotaged Iran's nuclear facility at Natanz. The Russian 2017 NotPetya attack on Ukraine, and cyber operations in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Spent a little bit of time talking about key takeaways, and just because every time I talk about this, someone ends up paranoid, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about some pretty simple things you can do to protect yourself, and sort of refer to digital hygiene. Okay. So on the kind of true believers side, on the alarmist side, a number of specific claims get made. The first is that cyber weapons are potent, they can cause a lot of damage, they're powerful, they're extremely fast, they move at the speed of light, and cyberspace is an area where the offense has a decisive advantage, that doing defense in cyberspace is extremely difficult. Moreover, they argue that because there are relatively low barriers to entry, unlike with the nuclear weapons program, for example, picture the sort of famous analogy or reference to a teenager wearing a hoodie hacking important systems, that this kind of levels the playing field between the big powers and the small powers, and that even empowers nations or non-state actors. There's also a claim that doing attribution in cyberspace is extremely difficult, and therefore deterrence does not apply. If you don't have a return address, you obviously can't do deterrence. Related to the point about these being asymmetric weapons, there's a bigger claim that the most developed and wired countries, for example, the United States, are the most vulnerable. If you shouldn't throw rocks, if you live in a glass house, the United States lives in the glassiest house. It's a target-rich environment, and therefore it's more vulnerable than other actors in this space. And thus you could see, and you see this term get thrown around sometimes, a cyber weapon of mass destruction. kind of the alarmist side. The other side of the coin tends to dispute more or less all of these claims. They argue that this actually, if anything, reinforces the existing balance of power, that truly crippling cyber attacks are only within reach of great powers, and certainly not within the reach of non-state actors. Conventional power and nuclear weapons are still the coin of the realm to these guys. Cyber weapons do have a role to play, but they're no replacement for more traditional forms of weaponry. It is possible to do defense and deterrence. And with the possible exception of Israel's pager attack on Hezbollah last September, for which I think we'll need to see more evidence, we haven't seen a single person die in a cyber attack to date. Moreover, they tend to say, look, you need to look at the full picture. The alarmists are only looking at one side of the ledger here. The digital age has actually had massive benefits, particularly when it comes to economic productivity and growth. Okay. I want to say right up front, many people don't find this analogy particularly persuasive. I myself have real doubts about it, but I think it does, if nothing else, provide some analytical clarity. You can see one of the articles that really brought this to people's attention, I think it was 2013, was called The Meaning of the Cyber Revolution. That title was clearly taken from Robert Jervis's famous book, The Meaning of the Nuclear Revolution. As I said, a number of US officials have referred to this analogy. So what are kind of the comparisons that people make here? No one really doubts nuclear weapons are an existential threat. Some people do question whether a cyber weapon is. So you do see that comparison made, that if you could picture a broad enough cyber attack that takes out the power grid, or leads to nuclear meltdowns, or air traffic control problems, all sorts of critical infrastructure going down, you could see a similarity. This is one area, at least in the United States, where the president has sole launch authority. That is the only person that can order the use of a nuclear weapon or a cyber weapon. Mutually assured destruction potentially applies, at least at the great power level. It's debated whether with nuclear weapons the offense or the defense has the advantage, but you do see that claim made. And fundamentally at the kind of most extreme end, the idea that this is such potent technology that it overwhelms core political calculations. You see this argument made with reference to nuclear weapons all the time. That if you can't escape mutual vulnerability, that means political calculations don't count in the same way they did prior to 1945. And if you believe that this analogy is appropriate, the same thing would apply to cyber weapons. That said, there are some big differences that I think most people do agree on. A nuclear weapon is not subtle. You kind of know when it goes off. Cyber weapons came out of the intelligence community and by their nature are very stealthy. Nuclear weapons, yes, you can target different things with them. There are different yields, but they're basically only good for one thing, and that's blowing stuff up. Cyber weapons can do all sorts of things. They can target critical infrastructure. They can also be used for propaganda operations. Think of Russia's interference in the 2016 US election. They can be used for intelligence gathering. In fact, I would say a great bulk of intelligence these days is done in cyberspace. And so they can do a lot more things than nuclear weapons can. With nuclear weapons, there's a debate over whether deterrence is possible, at least at all levels, but most people believe it's at least possible in many cases. As I said, there's a debate about this, but some people believe with cyber that's not possible. Yes, there are concerns about things like nuclear terrorism or nuclear black markets, but for the most part, nuclear is a state-level game. With cyber, again, some people think non-state actors might play an important role. We've had some successes with arms control and regulating nuclear competition. It's hard to believe not only that we haven't had any successes like that with cyber, it's hard to see how you actually could for a variety of reasons regarding verification. The private sector doesn't play much of a role with nuclear. It is a major player when it comes to cyberspace. It is both in terms of product development, cybersecurity, and the target. I don't believe this, but there's an argument out there that's pretty influential that nuclear weapons actually have a stabilizing effect because of mutually assured destruction. That is not really what people think about cyber weapons. And lastly, we have seen norms develop about nuclear weapons, the famous one being the nuclear taboo. Nuclear weapons are so abhorrent that a norm has developed against their use. We have no such norms, arguably, when it comes to using cyber weapons. So, just wanted to kind of throw that out for analytical clarity. Okay, why these three cases? If you talk to people both in government and sort of academic specialists, the saying is basically all of cybersecurity and international politics begins and ends with the Stuxnet operation. It's also a crossing the Rubicon moment. This is the first time that a nation-state actor targeted another nation-state's critical infrastructure. Can't really have a discussion of this issue without talking about it. The NotPetya attack of 2017 is the most damaging cyber attack to date. So also a very important case. This is sort of held up as what a taste of a large-scale cyber war might look like. And lastly, the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, I would argue, is a critical test of how significant these weapons will be, especially in a warfighting context, and could have lessons to teach us about a potential US-China war and the role that cyber weapons might play in such a conflict. Okay, first case, Operation Olympic Games, the Stuxnet operation. By 2005 to 2006, the United States found itself in a really bad way with the Iranian nuclear program. It had bogged down in Iraq. The Iranians had paused progress on their nuclear program after the US invaded Iraq in 2003, but because the United States was bogged down, they felt safe to resume their uranium enrichment program. I think the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, said something to the effect of, "Mr. President, I think you've invaded your last Middle Eastern country." And this meant the Iranians thought that it was safe to move forward with their program. The problem was, aside from the fact that Iran would continue to enrich uranium, the Israelis weren't necessarily going to sit tight. Some things never change. I feel like I've been teaching this my entire career. And the concern was among US analysts that if Israel struck Iran's nuclear facilities, the United States would inevitably get dragged into a war in the Middle East anyway. So this is where the idea of using cyber weapons to sabotage Iran's nuclear program came from. It was sort of seen as a viable third option between diplomacy and war, or at a minimum would help buy you some time to reach a negotiated settlement. So that was where the initial idea for this came from. But this presented all sorts of challenges. The first one is that Natanz, the crown jewel of Iran's uranium enrichment program, was an air-gapped facility, meaning it was not connected to the internet. So you could not target it remotely with malicious code. You'd have to some way find a way to upload it into the facility directly. You also needed extremely good intelligence. You would need to know the personnel working at the facility. You would need to know the network layout, what kinds of operating systems were getting used, what kinds of software was getting used. On the hardware side, what sorts of centrifuges were being used, how would you actually target them? This was an enormous intelligence challenge. You had to do all of this without getting caught, of course. The idea wasn't to blow the facility up. It was to sabotage it subtly so that the Iranians wouldn't know what was going on and therefore delay their progress. You couldn't update the code remotely. Even if you got it in successfully, typically the way this works is you have a command and control server that sends updates to your malicious code. Again, this was an air-gapped facility, so anytime you wanted to change it, you would again have to do it direct or in person. You also did not want to target innocent machines, and that's hard to do sometimes with malicious code. You wanted to target only this precise configuration of machines and no others. And in fact, the way the operation ultimately got blown was they got a little too cute with the code, it got too aggressive, and it did start targeting innocent machines. So This was a formidable set of challenges to overcome. Now they pulled it off. We're still not totally sure exactly how the United States got the code in. The leading theory, which is my best guess, is that this was a human asset, some sort of mole working at the plant, maybe with a USB stick that plugged it into the air-gapped network. This used 7 what are called zero-day vulnerabilities. That's sort of a flaw in code that can be exploited for malicious purposes. Typically, one of these things requires a private security firm months and months to find. Using 7 of them is really beyond the means of a non-state actor. That's an enormous number of zero-day vulnerabilities. The more aggressive versions of the code had stolen legitimate digital certificates implanted in it. These are kept under strict lock and key. In this case, there were 2 different digital certificates stolen from 2 different sites in Taiwan, which indicates, again, only an advanced persistent threat. A nation-state actor could have done this. They had to target what are called the programmable logic controllers, which are essentially the industrial control computers that regulate how fast these centrifuges that spin the uranium hexafluoride gas spin. They had this sort of cool Hollywood trick. They would record what normal operations looked like, and then while the code was doing its work, play that back to Iranian technicians so they were none the wiser. Now, what did the payload actually do? If you've studied nuclear enrichment or uranium enrichment, you know these centrifuges are very fragile and very temperamental and have to speed at a very precise frequency. What this code did was it would speed them up such that they would spin off their axis, or if you imagine spinning too slowly, it eventually will fall off its axis. They also jammed the valves that would pass the enriched uranium from one centrifuge to the other, so pressure would build up in the chamber, and that would cause them to explode. So just an enormously complex operation. Now, on the one hand, some people say, look, this did not have to be a discriminate piece of code. If you had a more aggressive actor, you could imagine it being unleashed on a whole bunch of other machines, including civilian targets. It was relatively inexpensive compared to other forms of weaponry. A single B-2 bomber in the US arsenal costs about the same as the totality of this whole operation, so it was a real bargain. We later learned that in the event that the United States and Israel could not get a diplomatic settlement to this problem, the United States had a contingency plan known as Nitro Zeus for a full-scale cyber war with Iran. And believers that this was really, really potent make the claim that this really is what helped bring Iran to the negotiating table for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, back in 2015. On the other hand, there are skeptics. I would put myself in this camp. This was a mini Manhattan Project, is what people call it. So the idea that a non-state actor could do this, to me, is absolutely implausible, if you think about what was needed. World-class intelligence assets, tons of digital computer specialists, nuclear scientists. They actually built a full replica to scale of the Natanz facility in the United States to run tests on it. They had exactly the right centrifuge models to run tests on. And even though it only cost the same as a B-2 bomber, $2 billion for a non-state actor is still a lot of money. You could argue the results were actually pretty unimpressive. This was basically the results, where Iran's centrifuge development levels off. That lasted by about a year, at most 2 years, after which the Iranians quickly ramped up their centrifuge production again. So this did not solve the problem by any means. I would argue the reason the Iranians came to the negotiating table had much more to do with the crippling economic sanctions that had been imposed upon them, as well as the potential threat of conventional military action during the Obama presidency. As for the kind of core conceptual claims, we know who did it, and we knew almost immediately. Even the pool of potential suspects was pretty small in the first place. So the idea that you can't attribute a cyber attack does not hold up in this case. We know it was the United States and Israel that did it. I'm taking a lot of this from a famous article by John Lindsay. Offense was not easy to do. Look what was involved in weaponizing this code and getting it uploaded. This took an enormous amount of time and resources. Conventional deterrence held. Right? The precise reason you needed this third option was because no one wanted to use conventional military force. So in that sense, cyber weapons were by no means a viable replacement for conventional conflict. And this does not show that this is a weapon of the weak. This was two very sophisticated technological powers. In the case of the United States at the time, the world's sole superpower, beating up on a much weaker actor. So not a case where this was sort of an asymmetric weapon. Okay, NotPetya. Since NotPetya happened, you might have heard there's a war going on in Eastern Europe. So I probably don't have to remind you all exactly what the political stakes of that are, but essentially Vladimir Putin is looking to maintain Russia's traditional sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, at a minimum keeping Ukraine a neutral state, at most turning it into a vassal state. So he does not want Ukraine to become a part of the European Union or of NATO. In cyberspace, this is Ukraine from about 2015 until 2022 is what some analysts refer to as Putin's petri dish. This is where he was testing out many of Russia's cyber weapons. The Russians actually took out Ukraine's electrical grid in 2015 and 2016 for brief periods of time. It seems pretty clear his goal was to send a message to intimidate the Ukrainians. Don't move too far toward the west, or you can expect more of this. All right, I think it's worth noting this was launched on the eve of Ukraine's Constitution Day, which is not a coincidence. That's kind of the day Ukrainians are celebrating their independence, so the message was not very subtle. How did this work? This is the logo for the GRU, Russia's Directorate of Military Intelligence, who we're pretty sure is who perpetrated the attack. They did what's called a software supply chain attack. Turns out the Russians have gotten pretty good. So every time you download a software update, whether it's on your phone or your computer, what's happening is your device is reaching out to the vendor's update server. Hey, we have a security hole, or we have a new feature that you can have. You have to reach out to the update server to download it. Well, what the Russians did was they compromised an update server for what's the equivalent of Ukraine's TurboTax. So basically, anyone living in Ukraine who's paying taxes would have this software on their device. Anyone doing business in Ukraine would have this software on their device. So when they went to download the update from this company's update server, they also downloaded the Russian malicious code. This was especially problematic because this piece of code had incredibly aggressive spreading mechanisms for a couple of interesting reasons. The first was the National Security Agency, the United States' National Security Agency, had some of its most potent hacking tools stolen back in 2016. We're not totally sure how at this point. There's various theories, but the point is we're pretty sure that the Russians were who grabbed them. One of those tools was called Eternal Blue, which is kind of complicated, but suffice it to say, on Windows systems, it exploited a vulnerability that allowed it to spread very quickly on any network using those same systems. That would have been bad enough, but they coupled it with a tool known as Mimikatz. Why it's named that, I couldn't tell you. This was discovered by a French researcher, I believe in 2011. This actually wasn't a vulnerability. This, according to Microsoft, was built into Windows by design. It still exists on Windows to this day, although it's disabled by default. Basically what it does is it stores your credentials in RAM so that you don't have to re-authenticate every time you want to use your device. When the researcher brought this to Microsoft, they said this would only be a problem if the device was already compromised in the first place, so we don't have anything to fix. What that overlooked was if you were on a shared network using a multi-user system with a whole host of credentials stored in it, and one device got compromised on the network, you could then get into the multi-user device and steal all of the credentials stored in RAM on it, which is exactly what happened here. So the combination of those two spreading mechanisms meant this spread like wildfire. What it did was encrypt the master boot record of any device that it infected, basically rendering it a piece of metal that was unusable. So it caused an enormous amount of damage. What was that damage? Worldwide, it cost about $10 billion are the best estimates we have. Most of it inflicted on private companies. The pharmaceutical company Merck, FedEx, Maersk, the global shipping conglomerate. This led to enormous shipping delays and all sorts of problems with world trade. In Ukraine itself, there was a major psychological effect, which I'll talk about a little bit more in just a minute. This hit banking systems, public transportation, you couldn't take the subway home, hospital systems went down, you couldn't load electronic health records, airports, payment systems, if you had a credit card but no cash, you couldn't buy groceries. It even took down emergency monitoring systems at the Chernobyl nuclear plant, which is not something that you want. It hit about 10% of all computers in Ukraine, which is an extraordinary number. And the claim is that if this had hit a country like the United States, that's even more dependent on this sort of technology, the repercussions could have been even greater. On the other hand, again, this is not a case of a weak power beating up on a strong power, very much the reverse. $10 billion is a lot of money, but it didn't even put any of these private companies out of business. So the idea that this is taking down nation states seems a little far-fetched. I would argue the sort of economic sanctions we've seen imposed on Iran have been far more damaging in financial and human terms. This is nothing conventional weapons couldn't have done arguably more effectively and with greater ease. I always ask my students when they're freaking out, when I tell them about this, how many of you had even heard of this attack before today, and the answer remains 0, which no one even knows what it is. Hard to believe it was earth-shattering. Also not a great weapon for warfighting because it's not discriminate. This rebounded all over the world. Again, anyone that had this software on their company devices got infected. It even boomeranged back and hit Russia's state oil company, Rosneft, so it actually ended up hitting Russia's own companies. Again, we know who did it, and we knew pretty quickly. The list of suspects who would be doing this to Ukraine was pretty small. You could argue it was 1. Moreover, this did not achieve Russia's political goals, such that less than 5 years later, they had to resort to conventional military actions to achieve their political objectives. So again, not a case where these weapons have replaced traditional forms of warfare. And if you kind of read of the effect this had on Ukrainians, it sounds more like the psychological effect of a terrorist attack. People describe feeling disoriented, massively inconvenienced, and feeling a sense of fear. But I would argue this pales in comparison to something like the September 11th attacks. So even in that sense, it's not totally clear that this compares with some of the largest terrorist attacks to date. Okay, the ongoing war in Ukraine. Putin obviously decided that to prevent Ukraine's defection to the West, he now had to resort to conventional military action. I don't think I have to explain to anyone here that that's the case. I would argue this is a good test of how worried we should be about these weapons in a warfighting context. The stakes on both sides are very high, about as high as they can get. So certainly they would be playing for keeps, so to speak. Many analysts, myself included, as well as many officials in the Biden administration, thought this was going to be the big one. If you go back and look at late February, early March 2022, all sorts of predictions that Russia was going to really try to cripple Ukraine with major cyber attacks. And especially because Russia at that point was considered so fearsome in cyberspace, that seemed like a good prediction. So I would argue if there was ever going to be a case where we would expect to see cyber make a real show in warfare, this should have been it. And that's not at all what we've seen. Ukraine has been very successful in thwarting Russian attacks, and it has not been for Russia's lack of trying. I actually have a really good student who looked into this very closely. Russia has certainly tried to penetrate Ukraine in cyberspace. Yes, electronic operations have featured in the war, but mainly when it comes to drone warfare, which that's somewhat different. Drone warfare is nothing new. There just haven't really been all that many meaningful cyber operations to date that have shaped the situation on the battlefield. Now, I suppose one could argue this is not a good test case. Maybe Russia was overrated. Maybe the successes they've had in the past weren't actually all that impressive. Maybe they're better at doing propaganda than pairing cyber and kinetic operations. There's some talk that they have bureaucratic infighting between different intelligence directives that have degraded their operational effectiveness. There's also the idea that for this to work, you've really got to seize the window of opportunity at the start of the war. That there's kind of a critical window that closes, and maybe they missed it. Maybe the stakes aren't high enough. I find that hard to believe, given what a disaster the war has been for Russia. I assume he would have shown this weapon if he had it at this point. But this is all to say, maybe you could argue in the context of the US-China war, things would look different in cyberspace. I think there are much better explanations that explain what's going on. Ukraine has received enormous help from Western Europe and the United States in cyberspace, not only from militaries, but from private US tech firms, especially Google, Microsoft, and Amazon. Talk about some of the specific things they've done, but in particular allowing Ukraine to disperse its digital assets across borders, meaning that if Russia wanted to hit those assets, they would be targeting another country. Ukraine prioritized cyber defense for obvious reasons after NotPetya. It's possible those improvements started to pay off in this war. It's possible that Russia is deterred from escalating in cyberspace, precisely because it knows, until potential recent developments, the United States has been giving it a great deal of assistance, and we know that the United States has laced Russian critical infrastructure with malicious code, just as Russia and China have done in the United States. So perhaps they're worried that if they escalate matters, they might have some problems on their hands at home, so maybe deterrence is held up. Yeah, it's possible that you need to seize this window of opportunity at the start of the war. It's also possible that pairing cyber and kinetic operations is just really hard to do. If you think back to what I said a few minutes ago about Stuxnet, it takes enormous preparation to get the battlefield, the digital battlefield ready. So pairing that with conventional military action might just actually be really difficult to do. And again, even in this case, kind of the more alarmist or the theorists of the cyber revolution, they also expected Russia to be the more effective actor in cyberspace here, even though Russia was the stronger power. So not really this asymmetry that the conceptual claim expects. Non-state actors have mattered, but not in the way that the theory predicts. They've mattered a lot on defense. These private tech companies have played a major role and have arguably had a stabilizing rather than destabilizing effect by protecting Ukraine's systems. Can't prove it as yet, but if it's true that Russia has been deterred by the United States, that would not only suggest that deterrence is possible in cyberspace, but that extended deterrence, providing deterrence on behalf of an ally, which at least in the nuclear space is considered extremely difficult to do. It would suggest that cyber extended deterrence is possible. And above all, it's hard to make the argument that cyber has been a real game changer. This war has basically been a war of attrition. It's largely been a frozen conflict. And when it comes to cyberspace specifically, we haven't really seen all that many meaningful engagements. So the idea that this has revolutionized warfighting operations doesn't seem to hold up in this case. Okay. I want to preface this by saying I sort of think of us as being in the 1950s or 1960s with nuclear when it comes to cyber. There's still a lot we don't know. There's still a lot of learning that has to go on. So I guess I'm just going to preface this by saying all of these findings are preliminary. As I'll get to, I could be wrong. But at least these cases have shown it has really only reaffirmed the balance of power, or at most been a neutral factor. It hasn't really leveled the playing field. Non-state actors play a role, but arguably not all that dissimilar of a role to a defense contractor, like Lockheed Martin, for example. To me, it's unclear, at least in warfighting operations, intelligence is maybe a different matter. But when it comes to warfighting, it's not clear to me that cyber defense is a space, or is impossible, or that the offense has the advantage. It seems to me, at least for attacks on critical infrastructure and military targets, like deterrence is possible, whether that's responding in kind via cyberspace or through cross-domain deterrence. Above all, I don't think cyber weapons have overwhelmed basic political calculations. Now, I myself am skeptical that that's even the case with nuclear weapons, but there are people that disagree with me about that. It seems more, at least for the evidence we have to date, more useful as a terror weapon. At least that's what the NotPetya case would suggest, or as a weapon of sabotage, or as a propaganda operations type of weapon. I do think it is enormously important for intelligence collection and intelligence competition. I think that is where most intelligence operations play out these days. So I agree with Josh Rovner, who said when it comes to cyber, cyber's basically an intelligence context. Now, I could be wrong. I have the cover of the book 2034 up here, which was a novel written by, or co-authored by the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO of what a prospective US-China war might look like. If you read that book, one of the first things China does is launch a major cyber attack on the United States. So there are people with far more experience in military affairs than I have who believe that this is a problem. But at least for the major cases I've reviewed so far, I would say I'm not with the alarmists. Just so I'm not engaging in what InfoSec people call FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. There's some pretty easy things if you're worried that you can do to protect yourself online. If any account that offers multi-factor authentication, do it. It's not that annoying. And it reduces your chances of being compromised by something like 99.8%. It's very easy to do. Password reuse. Some of you might have seen in the New York Times yesterday that the current Secretary of Defense had a number of passwords from his personal accounts that were compromised in a third-party breach that were put on the dark web. Turned out he was using the same password on many accounts, and that these were not very good passwords. We can talk about this more if people are interested, but I went ahead and looked at the 100 most common passwords used in 2024. I guess I'll read the first 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Password 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Clarity 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So if you have a password manager, that basically removes that problem. Freeze your credit at the major ratings agencies. Doesn't take very long. No one can steal your identity and set up lines of credit in your name. I'll skip that one for now. Careful in opening links and attachments. Social engineering is still the dominant way most people get compromised. On that same point, if someone ever calls and says, we need your credentials to log in, do not give it to them. No one should ever call and ask for your credentials. If you're concerned, hang up, call the number of the actual institution in question and ask them directly whether there's a problem. Download your software updates. You can enable auto downloads so that you don't even have to worry about it. Antivirus software has its problems, but it's better than nothing. It will protect you from known viruses. If you back up your data and you get hit with a ransomware attack, it doesn't really matter. You still have your data backed up, so you can retrieve it. If people are interested, I can talk about how to do this. There's 3 to 5 things you can do pretty easily to secure your home network. I guess I'll just say change the default password. If the username and password are admin, that's not very robust security. So that we can move to Q&A.
Well, that was extremely educational, and I hope everybody was enlightened in that discussion that you provided in the presentation. I wanted to mention that, you know, I'm always a little bit more concerned about what we don't know could kill us. And so, since the evolution of this technology evolves every day at super speeds, you know, I'm a little more of a believer that there is a possibility that could creep up and we don't know it until it's presented to us. So, I'm reminded of the great film, Dr. Strangelove. And in that, you know, I'm taking a line from that. Deterrence is the art of producing in the mind of the enemy the fear of an attack. So no one knew about the doomsday machine that was supposed to be out there that would deter an attack. But you need to have this information out there in order to have a form of deterrence. With cyber warfare, it seems everybody wants to keep control and locks on the information and development that they're doing. And that may be a reason why there is no initiatives to really kind of share information so that we have it as a level of deterrence. So if you don't know what the other side has, you may not know what's going on, and you may, as a result, cause an act to occur. As opposed to a nuclear weapon, we always know what the other side presumably has. So it's quite interesting. And that brings up, related to that, two questions, which is, do you believe that propaganda is a form of cyber warfare today?
Yeah, cyber warfare is a notoriously slippery term.
Right.
It's kind of hard to know whether we've had a cyber attack, a cyber war, or a cyber operation.
Right.
I definitely think cyber propaganda is relevant in the discussion of cyber weapons. I tend to think when it comes to foreign-backed propaganda operations, that threat is also a little bit exaggerated, if for no other reason than I think, at least if we're talking about the United States, I think Americans are perfectly capable of misleading themselves. I don't think we need someone else to do it for us. And if you take the canonical case, what Russia did in 2016, we now have pretty good evidence about who saw those operations and what the effect was. The vast majority of the misinformation that got seen was viewed by people who were already going to vote one way in the election anyway. I also like to make the point, to the extent it was effective, I mean, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 3 million votes, so Trump's victory in 2016 says more about our weird electoral system than it does about Russian cyber propaganda. And if you dig into what the Russians actually did to study up for this, they sent fact-finding teams to purple states that included New York, Texas, Colorado, and California. So even the level of sophistication to me doesn't seem to have been all that great.
Right. You know, tied to that is the certain cuts that we're seeing in various departments within the federal government at this moment. And, you know, the continued practices from the past are subject now to change, obviously, without the personnel. So in the area of propaganda, as an example, there is a little-known group called the Counter Foreign Information Manipulation and Interface Hub. I've never heard of it before. But basically, that's under the Department of State, and effectively, that's the group that distinguishes propaganda information in foreign nations that is caused by, say, an adversary, Russia, and then we turn that around and make it into, weaponize it ourselves, or at least get better control of that misinformation that's being propagated. So that department, I think, is being eliminated, and we won't have anybody doing that. And the other area that seems to be an interesting cutback that I came across was CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. And there's on the chopping block proposed 1,300 jobs now, and that's the group really responsible for our cybersecurity infrastructure protection process in the United States. So that potentially is being eliminated to a fairly large degree, and that, I think, falls in the Department of Homeland Security, another group. So how do you respond to that, what we've done in the past and what is going on now, and how is our security being impaired as a result?
I'll start by saying these sorts of employees don't matter until they do. And so these are quite deep cuts we're seeing across a range of federal agencies, and we might not see the effects now, we might not see them tomorrow, but at some point I suspect there will be a ball dropped that will be attributed to these cuts, and I think we should expect that. I'd be much more concerned about CISA than the, I can't remember what the name of the first agency you named.
Quite a big cut.
CISA was created, I believe, in 2018, and it's in charge not only of monitoring cyber threats to critical infrastructure, but things like election security. And aside from the cuts you mentioned, I'd be very concerned because the former director, a guy named Chris Krebs, is sort of in the president's crosshairs at the moment because he labeled the 2020 election the most secure in U.S. history, which put him at odds with the big lie that the 2020 election was stolen. He could have made a lot more money working in the private sector. This was noted at the time when he was kind of being bullied by his superiors. I worry that we're not going to be getting quality people in these jobs if what they're doing is being politicized and affecting them at an individual level. That agency I would be much more concerned about than the former.
Interesting. You know, we're looking at this problem vis-a-vis the United States and the security of the country. But at the same time, what's transpiring is that our alliances across the world are now subject to question. For instance, the traditional alliance with NATO, our partners in security defense in Asia, New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, etc., and Europe. We rely on those states to really sort of help us enforce our world authority in the military. How do we know what's going on with them in terms of cybersecurity that makes them not vulnerable to damage that we are so concerned about with ourselves? What's the standards that are being applied, and who's actually doing that already?
I mean, it differs depending on what countries you're talking about, but if you're talking about the Five Eyes, US, Britain, New Zealand, Canada, and Australia, the intelligence cooperation there is unparalleled. I mean, it's to the level of kind of what we see, you see. I expect that will be degraded as a result of some of these actions. I should say the president complaining about NATO allies is nothing new. Every US president has complained about NATO allies spending or lack thereof going back to Eisenhower. The plan was never for the United States to stay in NATO over the long term. So in that sense, he's not unique. The way he is bullying allies strikes me as unique. And we will certainly see that with intelligence sharing on issues like cyber. I think we'll see it play out even more, since this is also relevant to the topic today, on what's called weaponized interdependence. So traditionally the idea is, hey, if we're all trading together, I'm dependent on you, you're dependent on me, we're not going to have a war, this is a very happy world. It turns out that if there are certain choke points that one country controls, they can weaponize that interdependence. So the United States has done this with the internet since September 11th. It turns out the vast majority of the infrastructure on which the internet runs is based in a few square miles of Virginia. And so the National Security Agency is very good at tapping that infrastructure for intelligence collection. Allies have been willing to go along with that. If they feel mistreated sufficiently, they might build their own internet backbones. They might lay their own undersea cables. And this is complex technology, but it's not technology that other countries can't come up with themselves. Another example is semiconductors. The United States has been trying to deprive China of semiconductors to prevent the development of AI or quantum computing that could supercharge its cyber and military operations. That works really well because it turns out that basically any chip that's designed today, the actual software that's used to design the chip is made by a US company. There's a few that do it. But you cannot fabricate chips without US software. So you could kind of bring China's semiconductor technology, or imports, at least the super sophisticated ones, to its knees, if you have the cooperation of other countries that make these things like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. If they decide, hey, we're sick of being bullied, they could conceivably change their policy and weaponize that interdependence in the other direction.
You know, this is before your time. When I was growing up,
most of world history.
yeah, when I was growing up, we had a program for the civil defense, which was called Duck and Cover. We would have to, in first grade or second grade, go, if there was a nuclear attack, we'd have to go under our desks to protect ourselves.
I showed the
And then
videos
there
in
were
my class.
signs on buildings, you know, usually brick buildings, to go protect ourselves, and that was a safe haven from a nuclear attack. But, and to show you the folly of that, I grew up in 2 homes that had nuclear bomb shelters, and which was amazing. And my father turned them into wine cellars, and quite frankly, what the message there is that if we get attacked, you go into the bomb shelter and not even realize it after a certain amount of time. But I don't really see these civil defense-like programs today in the cyber world. I mean, you touched upon some important features that we should take care of personally. But what about messaging out there if we are under attack, like Ukraine, where the electric's turned off, we don't have access to our bank accounts, hospitals are closed down. Where is the educational process to contend with this element?
Of something like if an attack were to occur. I don't see much of it. And people do. Richard Clark, the guy who famously learned about 9/11. He wrote the first major book, I think, called Cyber War back in 2009, warning about this stuff. He lays out one of those scenarios. The grid goes down, air traffic control goes down, chemical plants start exploding. My sense is that the public's awareness is not nearly what it was with nuclear weapons, which is a little odd since everyone's daily life is now.
Well, we know in Newark what happens when the airplanes are not flying, so I mean.
And you could imagine a cascading effect. Now, I don't totally buy the idea that you could take down a huge number of systems for the simple reason that there's no such thing as a cyber weapon that can target every single system. That would be like a virus that infects animals, trees, people, there's different operating systems, right? Even certain operating systems like Linux have multiple distributions, so it wouldn't necessarily work on every one of those systems. Again, as I said, there are people who are more alarmed about it than I am. I haven't seen a lot of public awareness about that. Frankly, I haven't seen a lot of public awareness about day-to-day cyber activities, which is a problem because cybersecurity is everyone's problem. Just as an example, there's something called daisy chaining, which is if you can get into someone's email, you can then email their contacts, and their contacts will say, oh, this is from whatever Bob, I know it's safe, click on the link, and so on and so forth. I think for the most part, people are just kind of unaware of even at that level. So a large-scale civil defense program, I haven't really seen much. And we kind of saw that if you think back to 2021 when the Colonial Pipeline got hit with a ransomware attack. And that came back online in a matter of days, and it still caused massive shortages of oil all along the East Coast. And we saw panic buying, we saw huge lines at the pumps. That was a single company running a single oil pipeline that was down for, I think, 4 days. So if you scaled that up. I should mention, by the way, the reason that company got breached was because there was a former employee's account who had not been deactivated. He had been using the same password password on his work account than he had it on personal accounts. One of those personal accounts was compromised in a third-party breach. They reused the password on his work account, and it was not enabled with two-factor authentication. So,
I have two more questions I'd like to ask. I'd like to open it up to our audience here remotely. Do you see a possibility when you game these situations out, or when whoever is gaming them out, where we are attacked with a devastating cyber attack? You know, when we had MAD as the principles for nuclear weapons, we would accept 16% of the population dying, or 15% of the industry hurt, and then we would launch a retaliatory attack that would annihilate the other side. These kinds of
damage.
yeah. So do you see a cyber attack from if it was identified who launched it, from a non-nuclear state being responded to by the United States with a nuclear missile?
So it's been perpetrated by a non-nuclear
Right.
state. What does this cyber attack look like?
Would tell me what the level that is required that we would respond in that way, if there is such a level.
I think it probably depends who's in the White House. It would depend on all sorts of things. As I said, U.S. doctrine has changed such that in that event, nuclear weapons are considered a legitimate tool to retaliate with. If it's a non-nuclear state, I mean, if we're talking, a million casualties or untold economic damage, I don't think it's out of the question. It would depend on which state perpetrated the attack. Conventional weapons might be used as well. I certainly think civilians would be targeted. I don't think they would be off the table if it was enough of it reached a certain threshold. But that's a political calculation.
But the traditional rules of honor and war would not be a consideration at this point.
I mean, I'm not sure they ever have been.
Right.
In peacetime, we like to think they exist,
Right.
but the vast majority of people that were killed during the Second World War were civilians. Almost 30 million Soviets died in World War II, the vast majority. Obviously, dropped the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the World War. People talk less about the firebombing that preceded that, starting in March, killed more people than those 2 bombs combined. So civilians often get targeted more.
My last question before I turn it over is having to do with your profession as a professor at Williams College and other academic institutions similarly. You had briefly mentioned where we comb or where we attract people from colleges, universities, the workplace in a way that is meaningful and to go work for the federal government in these endeavors. We're competing against private corporations that pay out of the box 10 times the amount a person working in the federal government is 23, 24. They can get paid $500,000 or more at Microsoft or Google or whatever. So how do we compete for the best and the brightest talent to work in these areas on the government side when we're also confronting the cutbacks in academic institutions that are supposed to be motivators to get the best and the brightest and the most learned people in science, technology, etc. I mean, we're trying to deal with a lot of things at the same time, and we're basically eliminating the ball field in terms of potential people who could work in these endeavors for the government. But how do you deal with that?
One, I'm not optimistic. I would also add, by the way, the U.S. used to kind of be the foremost epicenter of, I guess, reverse brain drain. Talented people from all over the world coming to develop new technologies and innovate. Those days might be numbered. But even prior to recent events, frankly, I'm a little discouraged with where I see my students going after they graduate. They can make a lot of money in other industries. What?
That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's that and management consulting. There's a variety of paths they take. The federal government has struggled with this in cyber for a long time. I also think for maybe sort of obvious cultural reasons, there's a real distrust of government agencies among hackers. So I know that the FBI in about 2015 and the Department of Defense explored this idea of having, for example, people at Google do 2-year terms with the FBI or CIA or some of these agencies, and there was a deep reluctance on the part of some of the employees to do that. I think the joke I heard was Coney asked one of the people at Google, what, are they worried that they smoked weed in the 90s? And he said, no, they're worried because they smoked weed on their lunch break. I think that's a cultural divide that's tough. In general, what has bridged this gap has been the excitement about what you get to do in the job. That or a sense of public service. I couldn't tell you which one is more meaningful, but if you talk to people that do this work, the idea that you get paid to break into foreign countries' networks is about as exciting a job as you can think of, and it's really one of the only places in the country where you get to do that. And get paid. And again, if you just look at the Stuxnet story, that seems like pretty exciting work. That and a sense of service. And we've had an ongoing discussion or maybe we haven't had an ongoing discussion for some time. It doesn't have to be military service, but that at some point everyone should do a year of government service. I think that idea for now is dead in the water.
Used to be, sort of motivation to enter the Peace Corps back in the 60s and do public good, and I think we're missing that component to younger people today. I'd like to open this up to our audience, both here and remotely, for questions. Again. Yes, Ed.
You mentioned something I'm completely ignorant in this area. You mentioned that the backbone of the internet is in a few acres in Virginia, the worldwide internet.
Well, so that's where like the internet exchange points, many of them be. Basically, the U.S. invented the internet, and this is where much of the initial infrastructure got set up, and so it became this critical choke point through which a large percentage of world internet traffic flows.
Why would the Chinese be at rest with that reality? Why wouldn't they be setting up?
They're not. They've started laying undersea fiber cables, and they're looking to circumvent these choke points because they know as well as anyone else does that this is a problem for them. So we're already seeing moves in that direction.
Other questions in this group or remotely? No questions?
Hey, Brian.
Yes. Good. How are you doing?
I just appreciate your last point when you closed up about how the brain coming in to hack into the thing we need, hacking into on the other side. I love that. Well, thank you for that.
We're trying to maybe get an understanding of the comparison between what has been the protocols and agencies, these governing agencies in the past, and how that has changed. Could you kind of give us an overview of prospectus, the strategic thinking, and how that may have changed in the implementation of what we see? What's your opinion? It seems like every time I have a topic with GMALL, this comes up in some conversation or another. I'm curious from your perspective.
So the first thing I'll say is it's hard to study because this stuff is hideously overclassified, and that's a quote from a former CIA director. The whole joke about the National Security Agency, the NSA, stands for never say anything or no such agency. So it's a little tough to get in the weeds on doctrine. What I can tell you is that during the Obama presidency, I believe in 2012, was when the directive was issued that this is something that the president gets to decide. If it is an attack on critical infrastructure, if it's an intelligence operation, that's a different story. But if you're going to actually damage critical infrastructure, this was something he reserved to himself. I believe Trump tweaked that at the end of his first term. How much we've tweaked it, I'm honestly not totally sure. The NSA is the agency that actually kind of does the grunt work. It's the agency that infiltrates foreign countries' networks. It's the country that collects all of the data. U.S. Cyber Command, because it has to be a military directorate that's actually launching the attacks is who actually does the attacks. Now, the way they solved that was U.S. Cyber Command, the branch of the U.S. military, is housed in the same building as the National Security Agency. And the director of the National Security Agency is also the head of U.S. Cyber Command. So that's how they nicely aligned that. Doctrinally, I think the biggest thing that's changed probably since Stuxnet is that the gap is much more narrow than it was then. I think one of the key turning points was the 1991 Persian Gulf War, which was this stunning display of U.S. technological might. The world had just seen Iran fight an 8-year war with Iraq, basically to a standstill, and the United States won that war in about 100 hours. It was the first large-scale conflict where precision-guided munitions were used, and so the importance of sophisticated chips and computer technology really was showcased there. I think that edge, if anything, maybe even expanded during the 90s, but as always happens, the rest of the world took notice. And I suspect it would be hard for the United States to do something like Stuxnet again, one, because people are much more aware and sensitive to this sort of thing than they used to be. But two, other countries have caught up. Iran, for its part, is still kind of a middle power here, but it has made a lot of progress. I'd say at this point, the most potent U.S. adversary in cyberspace is China. You might have seen, again, this plays to the fact that it's very useful for intelligence. It was reported, I think, in November, China has breached the U.S. telecom network very deeply. And the problem is that's legacy technology. It's not technology that can be updated or patched to prevent that sort of thing. It's going to have to be rebuilt to be secure. So anything you send unencrypted, they can intercept. So this is how they were listening to both campaigns' phone calls, for example. That's going to be a long-term project to overhaul that technology. So you should use encrypted messaging for now.
You know, over time, in the last few years, the investment in AI has been absolutely phenomenal. What's the impact of AI in terms of cyber weapons, and where is that leading us? I think Dr. Kissinger's last book that he wrote with Eric Schmidt was on the dangers in AI, which I thought was quite unusual for a 90-year-old who's writing a book on AI, but he did, and got a lot of attention. What's your opinions of that?
This is great. I just had a class on this yesterday. The other one is quantum, would be the other future technology. AI, look, it's hard to say because it hasn't happened yet, really. I mean, to date, what I've seen, I frankly don't find all that impressive. I find the technology or the science behind it enormously impressive. I read about things like neural nets. But so far what I've seen is kind of a glorified virtual office assistant and something that can write subpar college papers. Now it's going to get better, and if you believe some people working in defense, and I couldn't tell you what people are doing at MIT right now, it's classified, but we might have things like autonomous drone swarms. I'm not talking about unmanned vehicles, which we've had for quite a while. I'm talking about fully autonomous. You have delegated the agency over the decision-making to the weapon, like fully robot weapons. We've seen a little bit of this in the Ukraine war already. I couldn't tell you how close we are to that. If quantum is the analog, quantum computing, it seems like the target date moves back 5 years, every 5 years. That doesn't mean it won't happen, but the estimates I saw were 2025, and here we are. It's potentially transformative if it's actually what people say. If it is truly humans are delegating agency over weaponry and strategy to machines, that would, yes, I would concede the point. That would be a revolution of the first order. I haven't seen it yet, so I'm not really willing to be as enthusiastic or worried about it just yet, but we'll have to wait and see.
I come back to the Russian attack on Ukraine and on Petya, which was phenomenal in terms of its scope, but one has to come to the realization that that worm software was originated by the NSA and it was stolen from them in order to make that attack feasible. So I come back to the question that that malware was basically planted on the computers long in advance of the activation of that malware. What in the United States do we potentially have that's sitting on servers in networks that maybe even on our computer right now that has not been activated and can be used if someone turns on the switch?
The assumption is it's there.
Yeah.
The assumption is that China and Russia and potentially other actors have laced U.S. critical infrastructure with destructive malware. I would be very surprised if there weren't pieces of critical infrastructure without that type of malware sitting on them, but the assumption among U.S. officials is that it is. And the assumption among Chinese, Russian officials, Iranian officials is that the U.S. has also put malware in their networks. The problem here has to do with what's called the cybersecurity dilemma, which is you could theoretically be hacking into foreign networks for defensive purposes. You could be trying to glean intelligence that helps you with cyber defense. It's impossible to know if you're the state on the receiving end what the intent of that malware is. And of course they all assume it's for the worst kind of purposes. The other reason here, people heard about the SolarWinds attack, which happened right before Biden was inaugurated. That was another supply chain attack. The Russians did the same thing. It was another egregious case of operational security by a private company called SolarWinds. It's unclear whether this was still the password to the update server that was breached, but previously it had been leaked online and the password was SolarWinds 123. But the Russians breached that update server and sent it out to, I think it was 18,000 different companies, many of them Fortune 500 companies, the Treasury Department, a number of other key US agencies. Since then, I mean, even before that, the assumption is this stuff is in there.
I mean, what's disconcerting on that is that we rely so much on our alliances, say with NATO, that how do we know actually what's already been planted on our NATO allies' servers and are sitting there so that if there's a chance that we have to go to war and protect the NATO interests of the countries, all of a sudden no one can communicate in whatever country and they can't get a hold of anybody on the phone.
But there's also a problem as to defining what would legitimately need to invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter.
Right.
Which is the attack on one is attack on all. It's kind of the heart of the treaty. When the Estonians were hit by Russian cyber operations in 2007, they wanted to elevate cyber to there. I think currently where it sits is maybe. It would depend on the nature of the cyber attack. But yeah, that's the concern. I think that's especially the concern when we talk about the US-China war. Is that would be kind of the first move. But yes, the assumption among all nation-state actors is that everyone has malware in everyone else's systems.
When we go back and look at some of these phenomenally famous attacks, these were famous in terms of their memory that we still have of them. The one that comes to mind was the Sony attack, which is the North Koreans. What was the purpose of such an attack? Have we ever actually identified it being the North Koreans? And what is achieved? Is that kind of sending a message from somebody of what we can do? I mean, what's the objective of something like
I'm
that?
so glad you brought this up. One of the weirder moments in international politics. Essentially what happened, yes, it is clear that it was the North Koreans. The US government was reluctant to publicize that because it didn't want to compromise its sources and methods of how it determined that, but it was the North Koreans. Essentially what happened was, I'd be surprised if anyone has seen this movie, but Sony made a terrible movie with Seth Rogen called The Interview, the plot of which involved him and James Franco assassinating Kim Jong-un. The North Koreans took umbrage to this, and so the way they retaliated was by getting into Sony's networks. They did things like release all of Sony's movies that were going to be coming out. They threatened movie theaters that would show the film with violence, which is why I believe The Interview remains to this day the highest selling movie ever released on streaming services. They did things like release internal executive emails that were quite embarrassing, people bad-mouthing different actors and actresses. So it was an embarrassment for the company, it was monetarily a problem, the company was thrown into disarray for a certain period of time. But that's a good example of where I would say that's a small state doing about as much as it's going to do. And while it's it's kind of a crazy story, and I find it hard to believe I'm talking about Seth Rogen movies in class. But that was an attack on a single U.S. private company that didn't even put the company out of business. And if anything, I think the rest of the world looked at the North Koreans like, what are you, crazy? Someone criticized your leader, so you're going to respond this way?
And did you have a question?
Yeah, could you comment a bit about the things that are in the public and reaching the general public about possible vulnerabilities such as TikTok? And I think there was something about 5G networks and these other things that have been in the news regularly and we're all aware of, but don't really know whether it's a danger or not.
So my understanding of TikTok, and I'm proud to say I've never used it, and I don't plan to because I think it's terrible for your brain. My understanding of TikTok is the concern is it's a Chinese-owned company, and it could be spreading misinformation or putting out slanted stories that are more critical of the United States or more complimentary of China, and basically as a subtle propaganda weapon with U.S. youths. I'd be much more concerned about the other effects of social media on younger folks. I think it's toxic, I really do. But that's the concern with TikTok, and initially it looked like Trump was going to ban it, and my understanding is there might be a personal lucrative element now that will benefit him, so it appears that that's off the table. You mentioned 5G. I'm not technically savvy enough to totally understand it, let alone explain it, but it's basically every 10 years the internet gets kind of a facelift, and the technology gets a lot better for connectivity purposes. The stakes there are, and we learned this with the Snowden leaks, this goes back to what you were saying about allies, right? I don't think US allies are too worried about spying on the United States, now that we know that the United States have tapped Angela Merkel's cell phone. But we learned from the Snowden leaks that the US has put implants in hardware all over the world for intelligence purposes, precisely because the US was kind of the leader with this technology. It was able to disseminate basically compromised machines that allowed it to gather all sorts of intelligence. So this goes for 5G, this goes for the Chinese company Huawei, the telecom giant. I have a TP-Link router. I've been told I shouldn't because it's a Chinese product, and the concern is these are products that will basically be compromised for Beijing's purposes. And because 5G is what networks are going to run on in the future, there's been a race to see who gets to build the infrastructure for it. And so the US government has been putting a lot of pressure on other countries not to accept Chinese-built technology. 5G is one of the important ones.
It's interesting on TikTok application, and full disclosure, I don't use TikTok either.
Great. Glad to hear it.
Yeah. It's interesting how there's sort of a dichotomous strategy with companies like TikTok in the United States. Here we are trying to ban or have them divest of TikTok into a United States entity. At the same time, and other entities which are extremely strategic, like our power companies or grid, many of them are owned by foreign corporations. So if we're interested in, for instance, National Grid, which is a UK company, owns power grids here. Same with Babcock and Brown, or Enel of Italy. So if we're interested in protecting our infrastructure for national security purposes, it's interesting that we're going to TikTok, but not things that really matter where we can turn on the light and make sure that everything is working on the air conditioning system, as an Well, is there any other questions from remote or here in the audience?
I'll say one more thing about TikTok. It's not totally clear to me that one of the main reasons for the opposition of the US government to TikTok is that it's beating US competitors. They frankly have a better algorithm, and so they're better at giving people what they want to see, and that's because China's government vacuums up data like nothing you've ever seen. If you go read about the Chinese surveillance state, it's actually pretty dystopian at this point. So they have better data to train their algorithms on, and so even people in places like Google say, wow, that's a very impressive algorithm. I can't prove it, part of me thinks the uproar wouldn't be as great as it was if it wasn't really popular and beating places like Meta or Facebook.
So would you be suggesting then that because of the control that the Chinese state has over its population and its communications and all of that, that they are in a far better position to generate, to use cyber in ways that the rest of the world couldn't?
No, I think they have better databases.
But AI depends on...
So AI depends even more on the chips that train it, and in particular the high-tech GPUs, graphic processing units. And NVIDIA is a US company and has a stranglehold on that technology. And the jury is out still, but if you looked at, again, this weaponized interdependence strategy I mentioned earlier, when the US did this in 2019, it put a major dent in Huawei's operations. That said, for something like a social media algorithm, having that much data is very good, and I think when it comes to intelligence purposes, you might have heard about the Equifax breach back in 2017, where half of all American social security numbers and their driver's license numbers and all the information you wouldn't want anyone to have, because of frankly incompetent and negligent behavior on the part of Equifax. We now know that was China that got that data. I think they have enormous databases on that sort of thing all over the place. So for intelligence purposes, I think they're in quite good shape. And when it comes to sort of domestic regime control, that stuff to me is dystopian. There's some insane number of cameras in the country. They have this social credit system, which you have to download an app that basically hands over all your data to the government, and in return you get special perks if you're well behaved on this app. It's an insane level of authoritarian oversight. So I think that's the most robust autocratic system on planet Earth.
This brings us, what a great presentation. I would like to just close it with a sentence. I was catching up on my pile of New Yorker magazines, which is like this. Before I came over, I was reading an article, and so appropriate. The first line of one of the articles having to do with if we could have averted the Civil War by Adam Golding. Let me just quote the first sentence of this. "We tend to treat wars in retrospect as natural disasters, terrible but somehow inconceivable beyond anyone's control." So I'm hoping that that sentence does resonate with the leaders around the world, and that they think about that as a principle before they make radical decisions in terms of potential war.
Don't hold your breath.
This might have a bearing on this topic. You see it more in discussions of nuclear weapons, but
Right.
if you buy that analogy, it would apply here as well. Look, I don't think you can escape the fact that international politics is fundamentally political. And if you can't resolve core political disputes, watch out. I think there's an idea that nuclear weapons might have prevented a great power war during the Cold War. I don't really buy that argument. If you look at the situations where there were deep political divides between the United States and the Soviet Union, think of the Berlin crisis, think of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Luckily, those were circumstances where you could find an off-ramp that both sides could live with that satisfied everyone's core political interests. I don't really see a solution to that over something like, say, Taiwan. And so I don't think you will just have peace because war is bad. I think you have wars because there are political disputes that are not resolved peacefully, so.
Well, thank you so much. What a delightful presentation.
My pleasure.